Alone in the world at 12 years old, with a mother 2 years buried and a father not yet cold in his own grave, Delphine Marsh learned exactly how quickly kindness dries up once there is no more profit in giving it. It was her father's business partner, a wheelwright named Hollis Pruitt, who had shared her father's shop for a decade and called himself family at every Sunday supper, who told the girl, 3 days after the funeral, that he could not be expected to raise another man's daughter for nothing, and that she would do better finding work as a hired girl than lingering underfoot in a shop that was now, by his account, entirely his own. She left that shop with $4 her father had sewn into the hem of her coat against exactly such a day, and 22 years later, a grown woman with nowhere else to plant herself, she spent every last one of those $4 on a collapsed, fire-scarred blacksmith's forge standing empty on the edge of a half-abandoned Montana mining town, a building so shunned by the townsfolk that the county had all but begged her to take it off their hands. It was, by any sane reckoning, a foolish, sentimental purchase. But beneath the packed dirt floor of that ruined forge lay something sealed away 20 years before, something that would clear a dead man's name, uncover a secret that had quietly starved an entire town for 2 decades, and leave Coldwater Bend, Montana, utterly speechless. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Marsh. If you've ever been told you were too much trouble to keep, and found your own way forward anyhow, we'd love for you to tell us about it in the comments below. Delphine's father, Thomas Marsh, had been a blacksmith of the old, patient school, a man who believed that iron, like character, revealed its true nature only under sustained and honest heat, and who had built his small forge in the railroad town of Miller's Junction, Wisconsin, on nothing but the strength of his own 2 hands and a reputation for work that never needed doing twice. Her mother, Anne, had died of consumption when Delphine was 10, and in the 2 years that followed, before his own heart gave out one gray November morning at the anvil, he had stood before nearly every day of his working life. Thomas Marsh had done something few fathers of his era thought to do. He had taught his daughter the trade as though she were the son he'd never had, not as a novelty or an indulgence, but in earnest, because he had watched her, from the time she could barely lift a hammer, take to the fire and the iron with an attention that he recognized, with a mixture of pride and quiet worry, as the same hunger that had shaped his own life. She learned to read the color of heated steel the way other children learned their letters, learned that a piece of iron glowing cherry red wanted different treatment than one glowing straw yellow, learned the particular economy of a well-struck blow, one that did the work of 3 careless ones, learned above all her father's deepest conviction, repeated to her so many times across those 2 years that it had worn a groove in her thinking the way water wears a groove in stone, that the value of a thing is never what it looks like on the outside, that a plain gray lump of or might hide the finest steel in the county, and that a man or a girl, he would add, catching himself and smiling, who judged only by surface would spend his whole life poor among riches he never learned to see. It was this conviction, more than any single skill, that Thomas Marsh left his daughter, along with the 4 silver dollars he sewed into the hem of her Goodwill coat sometime in that last autumn of his life, though she did not discover them there until weeks after his death, when Hollis Pruitt had already begun rearranging the shop's ledgers to suit an account of ownership that conveniently erased her father's daughter from any inheritance at all. Pruitt was not, in the town's estimation, a wicked man. He was simply a man who had convinced himself, through the patient work of self-interest, that the shop he had shared with Thomas Marsh for 10 years belonged more rightfully to the partner who survived than to the child who remained, and the town of Miller's Junction, uncomfortable as it was with the arrangement, did not trouble itself to intervene on behalf of an orphaned girl when the man displacing her wore a respectable coat and spoke, in reasonable tones. Delphine left Miller's Junction at 12 with her $4, a small canvas satchel of her father's hand tools that Pruitt had not thought to miss, and a grim, private determination that she would never again allow her livelihood to depend on another person's goodwill. She found work first with a farm family outside Eau Claire, doing the unglamorous labor of hired girls everywhere, but she kept her father's tools oiled and wrapped in the bottom of her satchel through every posting, every dismissal, every long winter of scraping by, and at 16, in a stroke of the kind of fortune that seems, looking back, almost too neatly deserved, she talked her way into an apprenticeship with an aging blacksmith in La Crosse named Otto Brandt, a childless widower who had lost his own journeyman to the war and needed hands at his forge more than he needed, convention observed, and who discovered within a month that the quiet, Watchful girl standing at his anvil could already read the color of steel better than most men he'd trained twice her age. Under Brant's instruction, refined over 6 years into something like mastery, Delphine became not merely competent but genuinely gifted, particularly at the delicate, unglamorous work of repair, restoring tools and machine parts that other smiths declared beyond saving, coaxing life back into iron that everyone else had already written off as scrap. It was a skill born, she sometimes thought, directly from her father's old conviction, and it followed her west when Brant died and left her his tools and his small savings, following her through Nebraska and into the Montana Territory, where the mining boomtowns paid well for a smith who could keep worn equipment running long past its natural life, and where a woman doing a man's work drew less scrutiny in a place already full of people reinventing themselves out of necessity. By 1893, Delphine Marsh, now 34 years old, had built a modest, mobile reputation across 3 counties of Montana Territory as a smith who could be trusted with delicate, difficult repair work, moving from camp to camp as the mining fortunes shifted, never quite settling, never quite putting down the kind of roots that could be pulled up again by someone else's decision. It was this itinerant life that brought her, in the late summer of that year, to a town called Coldwater Bend, tucked into a fold of hills along a tributary of the Yellowstone. A town that had boomed briefly on a rich vein of silver ore in the early 1870s and had spent the 20 years since contracting slowly, painfully, as the vein played out and the mining companies pulled their money elsewhere, leaving behind a population perhaps a third the size it had once been and a scattering of empty buildings that stood like loose teeth along its main street. She had come to Coldwater Bend on a paying job, repairing a rancher's threshing equipment before the harvest, and she had noticed, on her way through town, a building that stood apart from the other abandoned structures in a particular way. Not merely empty but shunned, its door boarded with fresh lumber rather than left to rot, its windows covered rather than simply broken, as though someone had gone to some trouble years before to seal the place rather than merely abandon it. When she asked the rancher's wife, a plain-spoken woman named Cora Whitfield, what building that was, Cora's face did something complicated, and she said only that it had been the old vein forge, and that most folks in Coldwater Bend preferred not to speak of it at all. Delphine, who made a habit of not prying into other people's silences, might have left the matter there entirely, had she not, 3 days later, overheard 2 old-timers at the Mercantile discussing the county's intention to finally clear the lot and sell it, the boarded forge included, at a nominal price to whoever would take responsibility for tearing it down. Something in her, perhaps only a smith's professional curiosity about an abandoned forge, perhaps something deeper that she did not examine too closely at the time, made her walk to the county clerk's temporary office that same afternoon and ask what nominal price meant in dollars. The clerk, a tired, sun-browned man who seemed faintly relieved that anyone wanted the property at all, told her $4 would settle it, structure and lot both, and asked, with a note of genuine concern, whether she understood what she was buying into. She did not fully, not yet. But she had $4 in a coat hem grown thin with age, the same 4 silver dollars her father had sown there 22 years before, carried through every hard winter since as though some part of her had always known they were meant for something more than bread, and she paid them over to the clerk without a second thought, telling herself it was only good business, a smith always needing a forge of her own rather than borrowed space in someone else's, and telling herself, too, that a boarded-up building at the edge of a dying town was surely nothing more than the ordinary detritus of a played-out mining boom. She was wrong, and she would come to understand exactly how wrong within the first week of clearing the place out. The forge, once she pried the boards from its door and let daylight fall across it for the first time in what she guessed to be nearly 20 years, proved to be soundly built despite its neglect, its stone hearth and iron chimney largely intact, though a fire had clearly swept through part of the structure at some point, scorching the roof beams black on one side and collapsing a portion of the rear wall. She spent her first days simply hauling out the accumulated refuse of 2 decades. Nesting rodents, rotted lumber, the rusted husk of an anvil someone had left behind rather than bothering to salvage, which struck her as strange in itself, for a good anvil was not a thing smiths abandoned lightly. It was on the 4th day, while leveling a section of the packed dirt floor near the rear wall that had buckled and sunk unevenly, that her spade struck something that gave a hollow, wooden knock rather than the dull thud of settled earth, and clearing away another foot of dirt revealed the outline of a trapdoor, its iron ring handle gone to rust but its planks, protected from weather by the packed earth above them, still solid enough to hold her weight. She stood over that trapdoor for a long while before she opened it, aware, in some wordless way, that she was standing at the edge of the same kind of threshold her father had once shown her in a boxcar's hidden seam. Though of course this was a different secret, waiting in a different darkness. When she finally worked the ring free and hauled the door upward on hinges that shrieked in protest, she found beneath it a shallow root cellar, dry despite everything, no more than 4 feet deep, and inside that cellar, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and canvas sacking, a small trove of objects that told her, even before she understood their meaning, that she had stumbled into something the town of Coldwater Bend had gone to considerable trouble to bury. There was a set of assayer's tools, a small brass balance scale, a mortar and pestle stained dark with old or dust, and a leather-bound ledger whose pages, when she carefully peeled them apart in the forge's dim light, proved to be filled with careful notations of her samples, weights, and assay results, dated across a span of months in 1873, in a hand she did not yet recognize but would come, over the following weeks, to know as intimately as her own father's. Beneath the ledger lay a small, heavy pouch that, when she loosened its drawstring, revealed perhaps 24 nuggets and chunks of raw silver or, rich and unmistakable even to her untrained eye, along with a folded paper brittle and water-stained, bearing a rough hand-drawn map of hills and creek bends that she did not, at first look, recognize as anything in particular. It took her the better part of a week, working carefully through the ledger by lamplight after her paying repair jobs were done for the day, to understand what she was holding, and it took a conversation with Cora Whitfield, cautiously begun over the mending of a torn harness and gently, patiently extended over several visits, to understand why the whole town of Coldwater Bend had gone silent at the mention of the old Vane forge. The blacksmith who had built and worked that forge, Cora told her at last, one afternoon when the two women were alone and the ranch hands were out with the herd, had been a man named Ezra Vane, who had come to Coldwater Bend in its earliest boom years and had been, by every account Cora had ever heard, a decent, well-liked craftsman, married to a schoolteacher named Margaret and father to a young son. In the autumn of 1873, the town's assayer, a man named Gideon Rourke who ran the small assay office that certified the value of or samples for the mining companies working the surrounding hills, had been found dead in his office, and a quantity of silver or samples belonging to the largest mining concern in the district had gone missing at the same time, samples that represented, according to what Rourke had reported just days before his death, a rich new vein discovered on company land that promised to keep Coldwater Bend prosperous for another generation. Suspicion had fallen swiftly and, as it turned out, permanently on Ezra Vane, in part because he had been seen arguing with Rourke outside the assay office 2 days before the killing, and in part, Cora said this last with evident discomfort, because the mining company's chief agent in the district, a smooth, persuasive man named Aldous Ferris, had testified before the makeshift miners' court that Vane had approached him privately offering to sell or samples of suspicious origin. Testimony that no one had thought, at the time, to question very closely, since Ferris represented the very company whose fortunes depended on the district's reputation for honest dealing. There had been no formal trial in the proper sense, only a hastily convened miners' court of the kind common in territories still years from full civil governance, and Ezra Vane, denying everything, had nonetheless been convicted on the weight of Ferris's testimony and a town's frightened need to see the matter settled quickly, and had been hanged within a week of Rourke's death. His forge shuttered by county order shortly after, his widow and young son leaving Coldwater Bend within the month for reasons no one had ever pressed her to explain, since most of the town, Cora admitted with real shame in her voice, had been quietly grateful to see the whole ugly business simply disappear rather than linger to trouble anyone's conscience. Delphine sat with this story for a long time after Cora finished telling it, turning the ledger's pages over again in her mind, and she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, that the assay ledger buried beneath the forge's floor was not Ezra Vane's at all, but Gideon Rourke's own working ledger, the one he must have kept at his own office and which someone, surely Vane himself, in whatever desperate hours preceded his death, had hidden in the one place a frightened, cornered man might trust absolutely, the floor of his own forge. And reading the ledger's final entries, dated the very week of Rourke's death, she found the answer to a 20-year mystery laid out in the dead assayer's own careful hand. Samples brought to him by Aldous Ferris himself, tested and found to be salted, that is, deliberately enriched with silver or from elsewhere to make a played-out or marginal claim appear to hold a fresh, rich vein, a claim that Ferris's mining company had then used to justify selling shares in a new mining venture to Eastern investors at a considerable profit, a fraud that depended entirely on no honest assayer ever contradicting the salted sample's false promise. Rourke, the ledger made plain in entries growing visibly more anxious across its final pages, had confronted Ferris with his findings and had intended, within days, to report the fraud to the mining company's owners directly, a decision that had apparently cost him his life at the hands of a man with considerably more to lose than a blacksmith ever had. The map folded beneath the ore samples, Delphine realized on a subsequent evening, spreading it beside a more recent survey map she borrowed from the county clerk, marked not a treasure at all in the romantic sense, but the true, unsalted location of the rich vein Rourke had actually discovered and verified before his death, a vein Ferris had deliberately misrepresented in his fraudulent reports in order to funnel the district's real silver wealth toward a shell claim he controlled personally, while telling the mining company's owners and the town both that the district's original vein had played out, a convenient lie that had allowed Ferris to quietly acquire, over the following 2 decades under various assumed partnerships, the mineral rights to the very hillside where the true vein actually ran, land that the honest records showed as worthless and which he had therefore been able to purchase for almost nothing from a town that believed its silver fortune truly finished. The pieces, once assembled, told a story considerably larger and darker than Delphine had imagined when she first pried open a trapdoor out of a smith's idle curiosity. A murdered man, an innocent man hanged in his place, a fraud that had robbed an entire district of the wealth it believed lost, and a fortune in mineral rights sitting, all these years, in the hands of the very man who had engineered the whole deception. And Aldous Ferris, she learned within days of piecing this much together, was very much still alive, still very much a presence in the district, though he had long since relocated his primary residence to the county seat, where he now served, with a reputation for shrewd and generous civic-mindedness, as the principal benefactor behind the very railroad spur that had finally, after 20 years of decline, begun to bring modest new investment back toward Coldwater Bend, investment that depended, as Delphine soon understood with a chill, on exactly the parcels of land whose true value Ferris alone had known and quietly hoarded for 2 decades. Delphine did not rush to accusation. She had learned, across a hard and watchful life, that truth handled carelessly could be smothered as easily as it had once been smothered in a miner's court 20 years before, and she understood, moreover, that she was a woman with no standing in Coldwater Bend beyond $4 and a few weeks' residence, accusing the district's most prominent and generous citizen of murder and fraud on the strength of papers found under a dead man's floor. She spent the better part of a month building her case with the same patience her father had once taught her at the forge, cross-referencing Rourke's ledger against the county's own recorded assay reports from 1873, which, obtained with some difficulty from the Territorial Archive, showed discrepancies exactly where Rourke's private ledger predicted they would, and comparing the district's original mining claim boundaries, filed at the land office, against Ferris's own later acquisitions, which followed with damning precision the true vein's actual location as marked on the map hidden beneath the forge floor. She also, carefully and at some personal risk, sought out Margaret Vane, Ezra's widow, whom she traced through a chain of inquiries to a small town in Idaho, where the woman, now elderly and still bearing the particular exhaustion of a life spent under an unearned shadow, had raised her son alone under a name not her own, having changed it upon leaving Coldwater Bend to spare the boy the weight of his father's supposed crime. Delphine wrote to her first, cautiously, and then traveled to see her once the correspondence made clear that Margaret Vane, after 20 years, had never once stopped believing in her husband's innocence, though she had long since given up any hope of the world agreeing with her. It was Margaret who told Delphine the one detail the ledger and the maps could not supply, that Ezra had come home distracted and frightened in the days before his death, saying only that Rourke had shown him something troubling and asked him, as a man he trusted, to keep certain papers safe for a few days until Rourke could decide the proper course, and that Ezra had hidden them, telling no one, not even his wife, exactly where, because he feared, rightly as it turned out, that whoever wanted those papers back badly enough to kill for them would not hesitate to search his own house and family first. When word eventually reached Coldwater Bend, as such things inevitably do in a town small enough that every stranger's business becomes common knowledge within a season, that the woman who had bought the old Vane forge had been asking pointed questions in the county archive and corresponding with Ezra Vane's widow, the reaction was not universal welcome. Several of the town's older residents, Men and women who had sat, 20 years before, on the miners' court that condemned Ezra Vane, or who had simply accepted the verdict at the time out of relief that the matter was settled, made it clear to Delphine, through pointed silences and the occasional cold word, that they considered her digging into old graves better left undisturbed, and the district's current mining company superintendent, a cautious man named Whitcomb who depended heavily on Aldous Ferris's continued goodwill and investment, paid Delphine a visit at her forge to suggest, in tones of polite but unmistakable warning, that a woman new to the district would do well to mind her own trade and leave old history to those who actually remembered it. Ferris himself, informed by whatever channel such men are always informed through, sent no direct threat, which Delphine came to understand was itself a kind of threat, the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years burying one inconvenient truth and saw no particular reason to fear a blacksmith's belated discovery of some old papers. He did, however, arrange, with a subtlety that impressed her even as it frightened her, for the county to abruptly question the validity of her $4 purchase of the forge lot, citing an irregularity in the original sale that his considerable influence over the county's finances made suddenly, conveniently relevant, a maneuver plainly intended to remove her from the property, and from the buried evidence still beneath its floor, before she could make further use of either. It was Cora Whitfield, of all people, who helped Delphine turn the tide, for Cora, once she understood the whole of what her new friend had uncovered, proved to have more standing in Coldwater Bend than either woman had realized, being the daughter of one of the original miners who had first staked claims in the district and a woman whose own late father had, Cora now recalled with dawning anger, once mentioned uneasily that his own modest claim near the True Veins location had been declared worthless by the district assayer's office years before Ferris quietly acquired it. Cora brought Delphine to speak, quietly and separately, with 3 other families whose old claims matched precisely the pattern the buried ledger revealed. Families who had accepted, 20 years before, that their land held nothing and had sold it for a pittance to men working, unknowingly to them, on Ferris's behalf, and who listened to Delphine's careful, patient explanation of the assay ledger and the True Vein map with the particular fury of people realizing, all at once, exactly how much of their lives had been spent poor unnecessarily. With Cora's family standing behind her and 3 more families willing, cautiously, to add their names to a formal complaint, Delphine took the whole of what she had assembled: Rourke's ledger, the True Vein map, the land office records, Margaret Vane's sworn statement, and the pattern of Ferris's own suspicious acquisitions, not to the county court, whose officials owed Ferris too many favors to be trusted, but directly to the Territorial Mining Commission's traveling inspector, a scrupulous, unbending man named Corwin Adler who happened to be touring the district that very season to investigate, ironically, complaints of irregular or reporting from several smaller claims that Ferris's continued dominance had squeezed nearly out of existence. Adler, presented with evidence considerably more thorough and better organized than the miners' court had ever bothered to assemble 20 years before, did not move quickly, for such men rarely do, but he moved surely, ordering an independent resurvey of the disputed vein that confirmed, within weeks, exactly what Rourke's ledger had predicted, and summoning Aldous Ferris to answer, before a proper territorial hearing rather than a hasty miners' court, for 2 decades of falsified assay reports and fraudulently acquired mineral rights. Ferris, confronted at last with a case built not on rumor or old grudge but on the dead assayer's own meticulous hand, attempted the same smooth persuasion that had once condemned an innocent blacksmith to the gallows, but found, this time, an inspector who cared considerably more for ledgers than for reputations, and a room full of witnesses whose losses could now be measured precisely against Ferris's own gains. The reckoning that followed was neither swift nor dramatic in the manner of a courtroom confession, for men like Ferris rarely break so cleanly, but the Territorial Commission stripped him of the mineral rights he had fraudulently acquired, restoring them to the district's common claim pool to be distributed among the families whose land had been wrongfully devalued, and referred the matter of Gideon Rourke's death to the territorial prosecutor for further investigation, a process that would, in the following year, produce enough corroborating testimony from men who had once worked for Ferris and long carried their own quiet guilt to see him finally tried and convicted, not for the fraud alone, which the statute of limitations complicated, but for the murder that the fraud had required, a charge that had waited 20 years for someone willing to dig deep enough to find it. Ezra Vane's name was formally cleared before the same Territorial Commission the following spring. His conviction posthumously vacated on the strength of Rourke's ledger and the pattern of Ferris's guilt, and Margaret Vane, Informed by a letter Delphine wrote herself in careful, patient language, traveled back to Coldwater Bend for the first time in 20 years to stand in the town square, while the district recorder read the commission's finding aloud. Restoring to a dead man the one thing money could never quite replace, though the mineral rights returned to the district's common pool went some way toward it, a share of which the commission specifically allotted to Margaret and her grown son in recognition of the wrong the town had done them. We began this story with a girl of 12 turned out with nothing but $4 sewn into a coat hem, and a woman of 34 who spent those same $4, 22 years later, on a ruined forge that the whole of Coldwater Bend considered fit only for tearing down. We promised you that what lay beneath its floor would leave the town speechless, and it did, though not, in the end, because of silver, but because of what that silver had been used to bury. A murdered man's honest ledger, an innocent man's stolen name, and a fraud that had quietly starved a town for 20 years while telling it, all the while, that its fortune was simply gone. Delphine Marsh did not set out to become anyone's champion. She set out only to build a forge of her own, the way her father had taught her that a smith reads value not from a thing's surface but from what patient heat and honest attention can reveal beneath it, and in following that single lesson all the way down through a trapdoor and into 20 years of buried truth, she gave a whole town back the fortune, and the honest man it had wrongly believed lost forever. Thank you for spending this time with Delphine Marsh and the people of Coldwater Bend. If the story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need reminding that the things we abandon as worthless so often hold the deepest value. If only someone patient enough comes looking. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.